So we'll continue with our discussion on aging of Korea. And this page now has a correct subtitle, a demographic time bomb. Anyway, this is what we talked about last time, and today I'll finish up talking about how Korea is aging, especially the factors for the low fertility rate, and that'll be followed by the economic impact of the aging of Korea, and that will be followed by the problems facing the elderly. Okay, so again, to finish up the section on the nature of aging of Korea, I'll talk about the reasons for the low fertility rate in Korea. So if you recall, there are two main factors which account for the aging of population in Korea as elsewhere. They are the longer life expectancy at birth, and second, and more importantly, low fertility rate, right? So I think it's very important to know why Korea is experiencing such a low birth rate. And first, so again, I'm gonna be talking about many factors for the low birth rate in Korea. And the first factor is, I guess obvious. Koreans are getting married at older ages due to longer schooling and working. So this was covered under the family. And it's one of the reasons why Korea has a low fertility rate, because when you get married late, that also sort of makes the age at which when they have their first child also gets delayed, right? So I don't know if you remember this, but as of 22, the age at first marriage was 33.7 for men and 31.3 for women. And as a consequence, Korean mothers' average age at first birth was 33.5 years in 2022. So if you look at if you compare that with the OECD average, which was back in 2019, 28.3, although they're not the exact same year, you can see how Korean women, as far as the age at first birth is concerned, or age at giving first birth is concerned, is roughly 5 years later than the OECD average. So that's definitely not a good indicator, right? Also, the 2021 marks the first time since statistics were compiled in 1990 that the number of first marriages for women in their 30s has exceeded the figure for women in their 20s. Second factor for low fertility rate in Korea is that, again, this was also mentioned when I talked about the family in Korea, is that the growing number of people in Korea are staying single, unmarried. For example, as of 2022, percentage of 45 to 54-year-old Korean men and women who remain single, that is, those who have never married, was for men, nearly 20%, for women, more than 10%. Uh, but forecasts indicate that the proportion of Koreans remaining single will increase even more in the near future, expected to rise to more than 1/3 and 1/4 of men and women, respectively. I'm talking about for that age group, 45 to 54-year old Korean men and women. So as this figure clearly shows, uh, more and more women and men will stay single in the near future. So the reasons why so many Korean men and women are remaining single are said to be the lack of financial resources, especially for housing, lack of job security or stable job, and also disillusionment with the institution of marriage. I mean, if you grow up seeing your parents always fighting, and not being so happy, although they stay married, you do not develop a positive image of the institution of marriage, right? Third factor for the low fertility rate in Korea is the high education cost. So, this was mentioned under when we discussed the education frenzy in Korea, right? So don't I don't think I should be talking more about this. Fourth is the stress of raising children in Korea, particularly due to education frenzy and extreme competition. So this is related to sort of education, right? And all the adults in Korea are fully aware of educational hell, as they themselves were subjected to such hellish experience, and they would never want anyone to experience the same. And that includes their own children, right? If they have any, that is. Fifth, high living costs. People's aspirations for higher standards of living make large families too expensive. Sixth factor for the low fertility rate is the pessimism over the future. Koreans are aware that only children born to, let's say, well-to-do families have a good chance of enjoying a better life than their own. So for the ordinary and definitely for lower class Koreans, they know that their hope that their children can enjoy a better life than their own is minimal. And seventh factor for the low fertility rate is that young people, when I say young people, I'm talking about people in their 20s and 30s, and their values regarding having a baby have changed. I think young adults today, again, adults in their 20s and 30s, they just have a different perspectives on life, including having a baby. They want to have more financial freedom, and they want to avoid financial strain. They want to have more time for themselves and to spend more time with their partner or friends. And they want to have more time and energy to focus on their career and or be worry-free about how children will impact their career. And they also want to keep their freedom and independence. And for some, they're happy with their current life and lifestyle and don't want it to change. And I'm sure you could come up with many more reasons why young people's attitudes toward having a baby have changed. Maybe in your free time, you could think about, again, more reasons why young people have a different view regarding having a baby or having a family. Well, if you could think of any other factors for Korea's low fertility rate, feel free to write to me via email. Well, there's one more thing I want to share with you, and that is this. In an Italian newspaper article on the record low fertility rate in Korea, the reporter argued that Korea's low fertility rate is due to the Confucian culture represented by the patriarchal system. He explained that Korean women who had been oppressed for a long time became more aware of gender discrimination through democratization and the introduction of Western culture. However, the change in social gender roles has been slow to catch up, and that has prompted Korean women to rebel by not having babies, with some women resorting to the four no's. That is, no dating, no sex, no marriage, and no childbirth. Again, that's according to this particular article or newspaper article by an Italian journalist. So if you want to look this up, I think if you just type something like record low fertility rate and Italian newspaper article, and you'll get some hits. Anyway, if the low birth rate persists, it is forecast that Korea's total population will drop from the current 51 million to as low as some 34 million in 2067. Like this. So, so we have 3 levels of projections. So the one at the top is, I would say, optimistic forecast, and the one in the middle is sort of a mid forecast, and the bottom one with 33 million, that's the low projection of the Korean population by 2067. Okay, we now turn to the impact, and I'm talking about the impact of aging at 2 levels. Again, one is societal, and second, at the individual level, right? So, having discussed the nature of aging in Korea, the next 2 sections will focus on its impact. And an aging population has significant impacts at 2 levels. One, societal, and second, individual. The impact of aging population at the societal level largely pertains to economic impact. And that's a key thing. So what are the economic impacts here? First is this. The number of the economically active population, that's those between the age of 15 to 64, will fall. For example, the number of the economically active population will drop from 37.4 million in 2015 to 20.6 million in 2065, a decline of more than 55%. So, 2065 is not even a half century away from now, right? It's what, 42 years from now. And by then, the the number of the economically active population will drop by more than 55% compared to the total in 2015. So what this means is a shrinking workforce, which causes GDP growth to shrink and investment to slow, both of which threaten economic stagnation. So this is so you can see the blue shaded bar in the middle is the proportion of the population who belongs to the economically active population, 15 to 64-year-olds. So you can see how it's, you know, shrinking over the years. And another way of showing the sort of the shrinking economically active population is that the proportion of the elderlies exceeding the proportion of 0 to 14-year-old 0 to 14-year-olds in the population. So the green shaded line is the proportion of the elderlies in the total population, while the navy blue shaded line is the proportion of the population in the 0 to 14-year-old group. Let me just skip that. Second economic impact is that there will be fewer workers to support the elderly. For example, the ratio of workers to retirees will drop from 8:1 in 2005 to 4:1 in 2020, 1.4:1 in 2050, and 0.98:1 in 2067. So I think the ratio of workers to retirees will become really problematic from about 2050, you know, because that's roughly 1:1, right? So what all of this means is a greater burden on the working population to subsidize the welfare of the elderlies. So these numbers, you know, in sort of a more sort of a graphic manner, I can show you this, right? Third economic impact is the lower labor productivity. Fourth, diminishing consumption, because elderlies typically spend less than other age groups because, you know, they're not working anymore. Many of them live on pension, or if you know, depend on the support from the family members, so they have less money than other working age groups, and they spend less. So a related impact is the declining tax revenues for the government. Sorry for the numerical typo there. That should be 5. Elderlies paid less in tax because either they do not work or receive relatively little income. 6, budget imbalance. The budget imbalance is definitely a possibility because government expenditure on the elderly will soar while its revenue in the form of taxes will decline. 7th, pension funds can dry out and funding for healthcare can become inadequate as disproportionate share of healthcare costs are spent on elderlies. So can't really hear your feedback at this point. So if you could think of other economic impact that is missing from the list, you could write to me and share your thoughts. Thank you. Given the potentially dire economic impact of the aging population, it is not surprising that the Korean government has introduced various initiatives to turn the tide, spending tens of billions of dollars each year in the process. In fact, the government invested about 200 trillion won, or not as much as 280 billion, but I would say, like roughly $250 billion from 2006 to 2021 as a budget for boosting the birth rate, but to no avail. Again, we have spent all of this money, but consensus is that it hasn't really worked. And that's being generous. It hasn't worked, indicated by the continuous fall in the country's fertility rate. And in 2021 alone, 46 trillion won was spent for the childbirth encouragement policy. That's the name of the policy the Korean government has. In addition to offering monetary baby vouchers to new parents, the government has also provided, so there's a typo there, the word government is missing, has also provided extended maternity and paternity leave, child allowance, free medical checkups for pregnant women, cheaper loans for lease or mortgage for buying new houses for newlyweds, shorter work hours for pregnant women, support for high-risk pregnant women, support for infertile couples, and so on, right? In addition, the Korean government conducted social campaigns encouraging men to contribute to childcare and housework, and launched media campaigns against abortions. That is in the past, the last point. Again, abortion as of 2021 is legal in Korea. The question is, why have all these government efforts, complete with financial incentives, failed to boost the country's fertility rate? If you're a policymaker tasked with making a policy to reverse the downward trend of Korea's fertility rate, what would you do? Again, we don't have time to sort of discuss this, but in your free time, you may want to give it a thought and see what you come up with. All right, the last section is again, I talked about the impact of aging population at the societal level, and now I want to talk about what aging does or what impact it has on the person. Okay. Okay, discussing the impact of aging at the individual level is also important because of a relatively large proportion of the Korean population comprises of the elderlies, and such a trend will intensify even more in the future. Okay, so if you recall, Korea, the proportion of the elderly in the total population in 2020 in Korea was 15.7%, but the proportion will rise to 32.8% in 2040 and rise to 43.9% by 2060. Actually, even more pessimistic estimate puts the figure at over 50% of the population at 55.3%. Wow, if that was to happen, just unfathomable. Anyway, the number of Korean elderlies will be between 17 million and 20 million. Okay, so that's quite a lot. So what kinds of problems do the elderly face in society? Well, first, it's the loss of a meaningful role in society. German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe describe the life of an old person as being characterized by four losses: loss of health, loss of work, loss of friends, and loss of dream. That's quite profound. With retirement, a person becomes disengaged from any particular role or work or any other meaningful activity. And this is what I mean. No, not well. That let me just stop there. As far as the loss of meaningful role in society. Again, when you retire from society or retire from work, you really don't have much meaningful role to play in society, right? So that's what the first point is getting at. Second impact of aging on a person is that a person can suffer from various health ailments. Many elderlies, if not most, have at least one chronic condition, and actually many have multiple conditions. The most common ailments afflicting the aged include all of these: arthritis, hearing impairments, visual impairments, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease, and many more. What's common to all of these ailments is that all of these are diseases that can be treated but not cured. Third impact of aging on an old person is what is called ageism. Ageism is a set of beliefs that is used to legitimate the systematic discrimination against old people. The ideology of ageism is similar to racism and sexism, as it is based on biological characteristics. Again, sexism, for example, is what it is because it, all these sort of negative stereotypes about different sexes are based on biological characteristics, right? So ageism affects old people in a negative way because people have these negative ideas about the diminishing mental and physical capabilities of the elderlies, right? So there are these associated negative stereotypes like, old people are cranky, they're depressed, they're bad drivers, they're asexual, and also, they cannot run or whatever. So if you haven't, if you're not used to this concept of ageism, I invite you to look it up on the internet. I guess it's one of the most often said comments by me, right? Look it up in the internet. I think it's a nice reminder because I think you should really make it a habit of always look for key terms, keywords, and making it a habit of looking it up so that you get a better understanding of some of the important concepts to know as a learning person. Excuse me. Fourth impact of aging at the individual level is the emphasis on youth. Societies all over the world are increasingly putting more emphasis on youth. And there are two important reasons that account for this emphasis on youth. First, industrialization, which resulted in the demand for energetic, agile, and strong laborers. And second, gerontophobia. So perhaps this is another term that you're not familiar with. Gerontophobia is the fear and dislike of the aged. Okay. And the point I want to make is this. Gerontophobia is said to be closely linked to the fear of death, because if you look at the period before the industrialization, the era, or again, if you go back to the period prior to industrial revolution, people's death occurred at every stage of life. So many babies died, so many children died, so many young adults died, and so many, men in their 20s and 30s died. So death was a regular occurrence throughout a different stages of life because of the lack of hygiene, frequent warfares, and so on, right? But now, in a typical peaceful country, and especially in countries where living standards are, relatively high, the death is something that is reserved only for the aged. So you die because you're old. So that's why gerontophobia is said to be linked to this fear of death. Okay, you don't want to get old. Yes, because you don't want to look old, maybe, but again, without you sort of thinking about it, subliminally, you have this fear of death, which is again associated with old age. Fifth is the victimization and abuse. Elderly abuse refers to physical or emotional abuse, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, or even neglect. In the first nationwide study on elderly abuses in Korea in 2010, it was found that 14% of the elderlies, or 1 in every 7 elderlies, experienced abuse. 50.6% of the abuse was committed by their offspring, especially adult sons, 21.3% by sons or daughters-in-law, and 21.3% by spouse. So well, you may say it's only from 2010, but there has not been another nationwide survey on elderly abuse since then. But anyway, what is shocking is that for a country that prides itself as a very Confucian society, which upholds this, value of filial piety as almost a religious ethic, to find that this high percentage of elderlies actually suffer from elderly abuse. It's simply shocking, to say the least, right? And again, I don't have any more recent data on elderly abuse, but the level, I don't think it has gone down. So again, this is just a guess, right? 6 sort of problem experienced by elderly at the personal level is the poverty and lack of social welfare system in Korea. Relatively large proportion of Korean elderlies suffer from poverty. As of 2018, 43.4% of Korean elderlies live under the poverty line, and that is the percentage of people earning less than 50% of the national median or roughly average income. Okay. The rate is the highest among the 34 OECD member countries at the time, and more than 3 times higher than the OECD average of 14.8%. So I'm sure you've seen this while walking on the streets of Seoul, where many, I don't want to say many, but it is a common sight, right? An elderly woman or elderly man collecting and carrying or pushing these carts full of cardboards, right? So this is the poverty rates of elderlies in selected OECD countries. And as you can see, Korea has the highest poverty rate among the OECD countries. Seventh problem for the elderly is social isolation and loneliness. You know, the so-called golden age of leisure following retirement appears to be largely a myth, at least in Korea. Life in retirement is likely to be inactive, with TV viewing and sleep outranking other pastimes. The elderly's loneliness is related to the rapid rise in the number of elderly who live alone. As of 2020, nearly 1.6 million elderlies lived alone, representing nearly 20% of all the elderlies in Korea. So there you go. So you can see how the number and also the proportion of the elderlies who live alone have steadily increased over the years, right? And the projection is that by 2035, close to 1/4 of all the elderlies are expected to be living alone, okay? So that makes them more vulnerable to loneliness, right? And I don't have a figure here, and chances are making them more vulnerable to depression, right? And this is the ratio of male to female among the elderly population from 1990 to 2020. And there are definitely more females who live alone. And that's also because they outlive men, right? The elderly person's life becomes more isolated and lonely when loved ones, close friends and relatives move away or die. And actually the latter is more true, right? Loneliness and depression are the most common emotional problems of the elderly. And this is the last sort of point under this section, and also the last point for today's lecture, and it's suicide. Just for fun, which age group do you think has the highest suicide in Korea? 10 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 39-year-olds, 40 to 49-year-olds, 50 to 59-year-olds, 60 to 69-year-olds, 70 to 79-year-olds, and lastly, 80-year-old or older, right? This is a sort of typical age group with which, data compiled, right? Well, you may have guessed it. The answer is 80 years and older, okay? So as I probably have mentioned in class before, suicide is positively correlated, generally speaking. So suicide, in general, suicide is positively correlated with age, which means that the older the age, higher the suicide rate. So as you can see here, this is from 2021. So just compare the 10 to 19-year-olds with over 80, right? So you can see the big difference there. And so the point I made earlier, that age, the suicide rate is positively correlated with age. If you see this figure, that point is proven correct in this particular figure, except for the 60 to 69 year old age group. And that is an exception. Usually it is, usually the suicide rate for 60 to 69-year-old would be higher than the suicide rates for younger age groups. But for some reason, in 2021, there was an exceptional year. And elderly suicide rate in Korea. So the navy blue line is the suicide rate of 60 to 69-year-olds. Yellow line, 70 to 79 suicide rate for 70 to 79-year-olds. And red line is the suicide rate for those over 80. So you can see that at least for this particular three groups, the older the person is, higher the suicide rate. And the main causes of having suicidal thoughts among elderly Koreans from 2022 survey show that number one reason, health problems. Remember the health ailments that elderly suffer from. So that's one. And it is the same as, and another number one problem. So it's both have a 28% response, and it's financial difficulties. So two reasons make elderlies think about suicide in Korea, and that's health and also financial difficulties. And those two are followed by conflict with spouse or children, and that is followed by loneliness and so on. Okay. So that concludes my lecture on aging of Korea. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.